My name is Sophia Briskine, and it is my honor to welcome you to the World Summit on Combating and Preventing Forced Organ Harvesting on Living People, particularly prisoners of conscience in China. I would like to welcome our distinguished speakers who are here with us backstage. Welcome to our registered audience who will be participating in a live Q&A session in a little while. And finally, I would also like to welcome those watching our live stream broadcast. Compliments to Epoch Times TV and NTD TV. Thank you all for joining us today. The event we are about to embark on comes as a result of extraordinary coordination across 5 continents between dozens of experts and hundreds of researchers, featuring speakers from a total of 19 countries. We will witness truly historical series of events addressing what some have dubbed as the most egregious crime against humanity in modern history. Prolific forced organ harvesting in China has continued unabated for over 2 decades, despite the magnitude of evidence presented in recent years by world-class researchers and investigators. Yet many governments remain silent. According to credible estimates, hundreds of thousands of victims, some estimate over 1 million, have fallen prey to this abuse of the medical profession. Some have even called it medical genocide. Yet many media remained silent. International regulations set by the leading health bodies continue to be violated. The lack of transparency is both alarming and criminal, yet many doctors and legal experts remained silent. We are reminded of yet another example of such deafening silence that unfolded in July 1942, when millions were marched into Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Dachau death camps. The New York Times published a small column on the back pages that 700,000 people were exterminated in the gas chambers. Meanwhile, the same edition ran a front page story of a governor donating shoes to the war effort. Where was the outcry then? And where is the outcry now? During the upcoming 6 sessions of this World Summit, you will hear world experts in 5 professional fields of medicine, law, politics, media, and social sciences. The final session will elaborate on the much-needed future steps and international policies required at this time. Our experts will discuss what mechanisms have fueled the indifference, what are the consequences of living with this atrocity for decades, and what can be done to end these crimes against humankind, to stop these crimes against every one of us. We invite you to be part of this important debate, from which no doubt solutions and justice for the victims will emerge, forming a vital framework for combating and ending the crimes of forced organ harvesting. Now, it is my privilege to introduce our host, Dr. Torsten Trey, physician and executive director of the international medical NGO Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting. Dafo has been twice nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize and was awarded with the Mother Teresa Social Justice Award in 2019. Please welcome Dr. Trey.
Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed speakers and guests, welcome to our World Summit on Combating and Preventing Forced Organ Harvesting. 15 years ago, when the Epoch Times broke the news that in China organs were harvested from living prisoners of conscience, the term forced organ harvesting did not even exist. This by itself already indicates that this horrific practice is beyond our imagination and thinking as human beings. It also means that in order to understand this practice, we need to open our minds to think the unthinkable. Over the past 15 years, independent investigators and researchers used their creativity and out-of-the-box thinking to collect and accumulate credible, book-filling evidence on forced organ harvesting in China. Implausible transplant numbers, inconceivably short wait times for transplantation that can be shortened to as little as 2 days if one pays an extra premium. A public organ donation program that claims to operate on an efficiency level that is unheard of in other countries. Admissions on phone calls. And last but not least, a plethora of eyewitness testimonies that leave no doubt. It comes as no surprise that the China Tribunal, chaired by Sir Geoffrey Nice, came to the conclusion that forced organ harvesting has occurred and continues to occur in China. The primary and main victims of this transplant abuse are practitioners of Falun Gong. It is estimated that several 100,000 practitioners and even more have been killed for their organs. Yet China refuses to allow independent, unscheduled inspections, calling the issue an internal affair. How can we respond at this point? History teaches us once again an important lesson. It is impossible to speak about the Holocaust without mentioning the Jewish people. And in the same sense, it is also impossible to speak about forced organ harvesting in China without mentioning the Falun Gong. Although the Chinese government attempts to deflect public attention by claiming the issue is an internal affair, and thus declaring it a taboo topic, neither was the Holocaust an internal affair of the Nazi regime, nor is the forced organ harvesting of living Falun Gong practitioners an internal affair of the Chinese state. In fact, in both cases, these are international affairs. This is the case not only because of its character of being a crime against humanity, but in particular in the context of forced organ harvesting with its ties to international transplant tourism, academic exchange of transplant knowledge, training of Chinese students and trading of transplant-related drugs and technical supply. Does the international community have the duty and responsibility to address this transplant abuse? This World Summit on Combating and Preventing Forced Organ Harvesting wishes to be an inspiration to galvanize further awareness and action. We will hear from politicians and parliamentarians how they are responding to the problem and taking legislative action. We look into the role of the news media and the issue of censorship. By default, the first task of the news media is to report facts and truth. However, another important aspect of the media is to connect people. Over the past 15 years, the mainstream media has failed to connect the people in the free world with the victims of forced organ harvesting in China. This separation between the readers and the victims is another often neglected aspect of censorship. Our World Summit aspires to overcome this problem of separating the international community from the victims of forced organ harvesting in China by sharing objective findings and insights. The practice of forced organ harvesting reveals two major problems, one legal and the other ethical. Legal experts will address to what degree forced organ harvesting is a crime and a crime against humanity. The medical profession approaches the issue of forced organ harvesting from the perspective of medical ethics. One issue that the medical profession has to come to understand is that the Chinese government, which has pursued an eradication campaign against Falun Gong since 1999, has delegated the execution of innocent Falun Gong practitioners from the court to the hospitals, and has thereby weaponized the transplant profession in China to become the executioner under the name of transplantation. However, killing a living person for the purpose of providing a cure for another person turns medicine into an absurd practice and violates the medical oath. We might find different concepts of ethics in different countries and regions, which makes a dialogue about ethics more challenging. Then how can we find common ground on ethics? A less abstract and more concrete way of capturing the meaning of ethics is to recall an aspect that holds true to every human being. There is not a single human being that has created his or her own physical body at the time of birth. We can build a table or write a book and then claim private ownership. However, that reasoning fails when it comes to our physical bodies. Instead of thinking of ownership, one might rather think of being the steward of the body that creation has provided us to live in. This understanding will very quickly translate into a sense of respect for our and the other's bodies. The respect for the human body that was given to us by the Creator will serve as a good foundation for ethics and medicine. In this sense, in order to combat and prevent forced organ harvesting, our first step should be to show respect and commemorate the victims of forced organ harvesting. Although there are now also other victims groups, such as the Uyghur people, we focus our attention for a moment on the primary victim group. Being subjected to a 2 decades-long persecution and eradication campaign, it is obvious that the Falun Gong have a message to share that the Chinese government does not want the world to hear. We will take a look. Falun Gong is a spiritual Buddha Qigong practice that abides by the universal principles of truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance. Talking about the victim's practice serves 2 purposes. It not only gives a voice to the voiceless, but it also provides the most powerful and most peaceful approach to combat forced organ harvesting. I hold that by objectively speaking about the practice of Falun Gong in public, the incentives for the Chinese government to use forced organ harvesting as a means to eradicate the practice and deprive the international community from learning about Falun Gong will be defeated, and the stealth weaponization of the medical profession will be disarmed. The earlier the world learns about Falun Gong, the earlier the forced organ harvesting of Falun Gong practitioners will end. With these words, I ask now for your attention to our World Summit and our distinguished speakers.
Thank you, Dr. Trey, for such an appropriate introduction to today's first session of our World Summit. We start off with a session named Transplant Medicine at a Crossroad, an ethics-based profession usurped and repurposed for genocide. To explore this topic in greater depth, we have 7 exceptional speakers, all experts in the medical field from across the globe. Before we start, please allow me to guide you through the course of our first session. First, we would like to explain to our distinguished audience that our speakers come from 16 different time zones. In order to accommodate all of them, the presentations have been pre-recorded in their native languages and provided to you with English subtitles. After we conclude the speakers' presentations, we will open the panel for a live Q&A session with the speakers. You would be able to use a chat panel to submit questions. And now, without further ado, let's welcome our first speaker. Joining us from Taiwan, we have Dr. Shi-wei Huang, Director of Urology at the National Taiwan University Hospital, Yunlin Branch. For over 2 decades, China has been involved in unethical organ harvesting. Traditionally, Chinese people are reluctant to donate organs. In fact, between 2003 and 2009, there were just 130 donors listed on the official registers. Yet thousands of transplants occurred in the hospitals. Where could these organs come from? Dr. Huang will now share his insights and perspective from Taiwan. His 15-year research into this field and having first-hand access to information will no doubt give us a unique insight. Please welcome Dr. Huang.
大家好，我是一位泌尿科医师。我今天跟大家分享从一位台湾医师的角度来看中国大陆的器官移植。我从2001年就开始注意到台湾民众前往中国接受移植手术，从2006年就开始研究这个议题，一直到今天。由于同文同种，台湾民众从90年代开始就前往中国接受肾脏移植手术。但数量从2000年后开始急剧的增加，在2000年前到中国肝移植很罕见，也是到2000年后急速增加。过去20年，有超过4000位台湾民众前往中国接受移植手术，不只是台湾、韩国、日本、东南亚、中东，甚至于西方国家人民，也在2000年后蜂拥的到中国接受移植手术。我们的团队和超过100位到中国移植旅游的病患，以及中介和移植医师谈过。中国的器官移植可以分成4个阶段，分别以2000年、2007年、2015年为界，有改变的和不变的。改变的是中国对器官移植的论述不断的改变，没有改变的是到今天为止，中国的器官移植仍然是一个不透明的系统和高利润的产业。在2000年到2006年之间，我们知道中国有很多的器官供应库，这些供应库是由解放军负责管理和营运的。每一个供应库，我们估计随时有数千人以上的供体资料来供配对，而这些供体库，过去我们一直认为是死刑犯的供应库。当时在台湾对中国器官移植主要的争议不是器官来源，而是中共医师摘取器官的方式。我们知道手段是很残忍的，他们只是制造一个枪伤的人，或者是简单注射麻药后的囚犯，然后就被偷摘走器官。这样的目的是确保过程中囚犯还没有死亡，器官还有正常的血流。一直到2006年才知道这些供应库主要来自防空学院。到2007年之后，中国移植最大改变是费用越来越昂贵，还有整个移植过程越来越隐秘，讯息越来越不透明，器官来源也成为不可谈的秘密。2015年后，中共声称他们已经改革了器官移植体系，只有合格的医院才能够执行移植手术，所有的器官都进入器官分配系统做公平的分配。他们的系统也符合世界卫生组织的标准，然后停止使用死囚器官。这是真的吗？世界卫生组织器官移植指导原则中，对器官来源有2个基本的原则，是可塑性，还有透明。何谓透明？最重要的是它的系统资讯必须对公众开放，任何人都可以检视它的真实性。我们来看美国的 UNOS 系统，它提供国家、州、医院层级的器官移植病人和捐献者所有不涉及隐私的相关资料。可是中国的系统呢，它只提供一个全国的数字，不提供任何一家医院的数字。它的讯息是不对公众开放的。就算到今天，我们搜寻到一份公开的报告，2015到2018年中国器官移植发展报告，和其他国家比起来，里面仍然是提供非常有限的讯息。为什么中共不提供和外国一样的讯息给公众呢？因为医院的员工很快就会知道数据是造假的。我们可以来看几个例子。第一个是浙大医院郑树生，他的论文遭到 Liver International 撤稿的事件。他在文章中说， 从2010年到2014年，他们医院有560个合乎伦理的行使捐赠肝脏移植手术。遭到专家质疑后，因为提不出可靠的证据而被撤稿。最后，黄杰夫表示，在中国的系统中，浙大医院在这段时间只有116例，文章是造假的。这时，通讯作者郑书生改口说，文章是在他不知情的情况下被投稿的，虽然他是通讯作者。563是115的4倍，哪一个数字才是真的？第二个是2019年安徽华阴县人民医院假捐献真倒卖器官的事件。这个事件中，加护病房主任勾结器官移植中心，以捐赠的名义用20万人民币欺骗家属倒卖器官，因为家庭的纠纷被小儿子举报。安徽事件中涉及到4家器官移植中心的造假：江苏省人民医院、南京骨头医院、天津第一中心、北京解放军302医院。这个事件中虽然有移植和摘取器官的手术，但是所有相关的病历记录在医院都是不存在的。最后我们看到的只有安徽的医院医师被处分，这4家移植中心没有受到任何的处分。那中国的移植中心有多少地下移植手术呢？第三个，我们来看台湾前往中国移植旅游的病患。台湾从2015年7月开始，要求境外移植旅游的病患回国要登录。从2015年7月到2019年7月，有360位病患完成登录，仍然有一些遗漏的，但其中有95%是到中国。我们可以发现，其中有5位病患是到没有资格的医院接受移植手术，4位病患移植医师并不属于那一家移植医院，另外还有7位病患是到柬埔寨，但医师来自中国。我们可以发现，没有资格医院仍然在对境外民众执行移植手术。那么还有多少没有资格的医院还在执行手术呢？我们要知道，这些医院都是有党支部的，都是在共产党的控制之下。这3件事情可以看出来，医院、省、国家层级的数字是斗不起来的。医院实际移植数字远远超过国家统计数字。中国的地下移植数量还是很可观的，而且很多参与的都是大型的器官移植中心。因为中国的讯息是不透明的，医学界只能够依赖中国官方的说法。问题是我们能够信赖北京的说法吗？我们来看看黄杰夫对死囚器官的说法。他的说法就是前后矛盾，内外有别。他有7种不同的说法。在2006年之前，他说中国的器官全来自公民捐献。07年到12年，他说器官来自于死囚，但是都有知情同意。到了12年、15年，他改口说，这些死囚器官还没有经过囚犯或家属的同意。2015年，他说死囚器官是肮脏的利益链，这些罪恶都是来自于政法委书记周永康。在2015年2月，他对中国媒体说，死囚器官只要进入捐赠系统，就是公民捐献，不再使用死囚捐献这个名词。遭到国际人士质疑之后，在2015年11月，他说系统不再允许使用死囚器官，但是不是停止使用死囚器官。但是我们知道死囚器官的法令到今天都还没有废止，那中国还有在用死囚器官吗？到现在，器官移植仍然是中国一些医院的主要创收来源。2007年之后，供体的价钱不断提高，到今天对中国人而言，一个肾脏移植手术如果使用的是尸体器官，要花费$500，但是如果是亲属捐赠，连同捐赠的医疗费用只需要$16,000，这中间$34,000 也叫重体费，这$34,000也叫共体费，也是一个器官中介、买卖、偷窃的重要诱因。对医院的收入，我们以北京309医院自己所宣称的，移植部门是他们医院最赚钱的收入来源。移植收入从2006年的$450万增加到2010年的$3000万，收入是持续一年一年的增加。另外，我们看到中国的移植医院病房仍然持续的扩张，但相反的，在2006年到2015年中，中共统计数字却呈现手术数量不增反减。那么，为何这些医院还需要不断的扩建病房呢？但是相反的，2006年到2015年，中共的统计数字却呈现手术数量不增反减。那么为何需要不断的扩张病房呢？到今天，中国的器官移植仍然是不透明的和黑箱的。官方的移植数量、器官来源、器官分配的说法是不可信的。器官移植是一个高获利的产业。对中国人和外国人来说，只要有钱，等待时间仍然只需要1到2周。由于不透明，中国的系统仍然是不值得信赖的。为何中共不让他的系统透明呢？主要的是他们仍然在欺骗和隐瞒中国人。到今天，器官代表巨额的金钱，中国的医院和医师们用他们不同的渠道在寻找器官。从2000年到2006年，器官主要来自法轮功学员。到2007年后，除了法轮功学员以外，维吾尔族人、少数族群其他囚犯也成为受害者。除此之外，器官买卖、偷盗也更加横行。中国要成为一个真正合乎伦理和法律的器官移植国，它的器官移植手术就不能是一个庞大的利润市场。移植捐赠和分配系统必须完全透明，而且要对公众开放。另外，在中国，只要人权迫害持续存在，资讯持续不透明，那么滥用器官移植手术就不可能消失。谢谢大家。
Thank you for that really insightful presentation, Dr. Huang. And indeed, China's transplant market is an opaque, lucrative, and an absolutely billion-dollar industry. Now, to our next speaker. From Germany, we are honored to welcome Professor Huige Li, Professor of Pharmacology at the University Medical Center at Mainz. As we dive into the topic further, we'll learn that China did not have a public donation program before 2013. So a very pressing question is, where are the tens of thousands of organs come from? Our next speaker will analyze in detail China's medical laws and the various pathways of organ procurement.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Huige Li. I am a professor of pharmacology at the University Medical Center in Mainz, Germany. At first, I would like to thank the organizer for this opportunity. China's transplantation medicine started with organ harvesting from prisoners sentenced to death. But in some well-documented cases, the prisoners were not killed immediately. The gunshot was not to the head. Instead, the gunshot was to the right side of the chest. The purpose was to enable organ perfusion and to increase the organ quality. This case was confirmed by one of the officers who performed the execution. Another case was described by the doctor himself who performed the organ harvesting. In 2015, Dr. Jiang Yanyong was interviewed by a Hong Kong journalist. He said that later the prisoners were shot but not completely killed, implying that such crimes are like open secret in this business. We are now within the COVID-19 pandemic, which is caused by SARS coronavirus 2. The SARS coronavirus 1 caused an epidemic in China in 2003. Also at that time, the Chinese government tried to cover up the epidemic. It is because Jiang Yanyong exposed the SARS epidemic to international journalists that forced the Chinese government from covering up to combating the virus. We can say that it is Jiang Yanyong's courage that had prevented the first corona pandemic. You can read details of organ harvesting from prisoners executed incompletely by shooting in our publication. So this is the first type of live organ harvesting. We know that such cases happened. We do not know how often such crimes happened. This is another publication from ours. Since 1997, execution in China has been increasingly performed by lethal injection. But how were organs harvested from such prisoners? This is an article from the Intermediate People's Court of the Luan City. In this article, the authors said that one of the advantages of lethal injection is that it takes only tens of seconds from the start of the injection to the death of the death row prisoner. Let me repeat it. It is not tens of seconds after ending the injection. It takes only tens of seconds from the start of the injection to the death of the death row prisoners. You do not need to be a medical professional, and you can be sure that the prisoners were not dead after tens of seconds. There are publications from the US. Here you can see, depending on different protocols, it can take 9 minutes to 13 minutes from the start of the injection to cardiac arrest. And in the US, the prisoner guard wait for another 5 minutes before announcing death. So that's why we can be sure that in China, after tens of seconds, the prisoners are not dead. But why do they do this? In this article, it is stated that execution by injection provides donor organs in better quality and greatly improves the utilization rate of death row prisoners' organs. So this is for organ harvesting. So if such a prisoner is harvested for organ transplantation, it is always under such a condition in a state that the prisoner is still alive. So it's unethical. But the next question is, do the prisoners suffer from pain? This is a publication in the Lancet journal, which stated that post-mortem concentration of thiopenta, which is the anesthetic component in the lethal injection, so in the blood was lower than that required for surgery in 88% of the cases. In 43% of the cases, the inmates had concentrations consistent with awareness. That's why lethal injection is not human. If such situations are applicable, if such situations can be applied to the situation in China, it would mean that the prisoners must have suffered from extreme pain. So this is a second type of organ harvesting, of live organ harvesting. Type 1, Type 2 are prisoners sentenced to death. That's why there must be a form of execution. But how about prisoners of conscience? Political prisoners, they have no death sentence. How are the organs harvested from such prisoners? This is a publication in a medical journal, Henan Medical Research. The heart transplantation was performed at the Chinese People's Armed Police Forces hospital, so a hospital of a military, a kind of military hospital. So the heart transplantation was performed in 2001. In 2001, there was no concept of brain death in 2001. That's why this so-called donor cannot be a brain death patient. If we look at the procedure of donor heart removal, here we can see at first systemic hyperionization was performed, and systemic hyperionization can only work if the heart is working, if the circulation is working. So the person is also not a cardiac dead person. Here it is very clear if you look further. Cold cardioplegia solution was delivered to the heart through the aortic route until the heart stopped beating. So the heart was beating. So it is a cold cardioplegic solution caused cardiac arrest. So this person, this so-called donor, was not a brain death patient, is not a cardiac patient, it was a living person who was killed by the medical professionals. This is very likely the situation of organ harvesting from prisoners of conscience. If a prisoner of conscience is harvested for organ transplantation, it is always under such a condition. It would be a nonsense from the view of the doctors to kill the person first and then to remove the organs. China has no brain death legislation. In 2003, the Ministry of Health drafted brain death determination criteria and brain death determination of technical specification. From that year on, brain death determination was performed and organ donation after brain death were carried out. In the published criteria for brain death determination, it is stated very clearly that 3 conditions must be fulfilled for diagnosis of brain death: deep coma, absence of brainstem reflexes, and also absence of spontaneous respiration. It's stated very clearly in such publications that the absence of spontaneous respiration must be confirmed by apnea test. And an apnea test can only be performed by disconnecting the patient from the ventilator for 8 to 10 minutes. It means very clearly that a brain death determination can only be performed in a patient who is already on the ventilator. But it is not the case in some publications from China. This is a publication from the Kunming Medical University. In this publication, they claimed that all the 7 donors were brain dead, but without giving the cause of coma, and the phrase brain death determination was not mentioned in the article even once. If you look at how the heart was removed, it is stated in the article that after donor's brain death, intratracheal intubation was performed for mechanical ventilation. As we have just learned that brain death determination can only be performed in a patient who is already on a ventilator. So after brain death, to perform the intubation for ventilation is a bad joke. So it means that brain death diagnosis was not performed. It's not a brain death patient. If we look at further, the intubation and mechanical ventilation was directly followed by the heart removal procedure. Also here it's very clearly that the heart was working, and it is the cold solution that induced cardiac arrest. So in this case, it's very clear brain death determination was not performed and the heart was working, means that it is also not a cardiac death patient, neither brain death nor cardiac death. It was a living patient who was killed by the doctors by removing the heart. And there are more such cases. This is a publication from a military hospital. Here you can see after brain death, intratracheal intubation was performed. Also here another publication from a university hospital. Intubation was directly formed by the organ removal procedure. Here's another hospital. After acute brain death, intubation was performed. And here another publication from a military hospital. Also here, intubation was directly performed by heart removal. Also here, in this case, it is very clearly that the heart was working. The heart was emptied by several heartbeats. The heart was beating. So in such cases, the so-called donors was not brain dead because brain death determination was not performed, and in some cases it's very clearly the heart was working. So neither brain dead nor cardiac dead. So in such cases, it was living person who was killed by the doctors. This is the fourth type of organ harvesting from living persons. If we conclude, in China, from the very beginning, prisoners sentenced to death were used for organ harvesting, so this is unethical, very clear. And Chinese officials have already admitted that before the year of 2010, the organs from death row prisoners were removed mostly without consent. Even according to Chinese laws, this was crime and systemic crime. And live organ harvesting, meaning that organ harvesting from a still living person was carried out both from prisoners sentenced to death and from political prisoners. And this is a crime against humanity. This is the end of my presentation, and thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
And thank you, Professor Li, for that very detailed and, in fact, such an important element of this topic that we're discussing today is how doctors have become the criminals in this horrific practice of forced organ harvesting and these chilling accounts of living persons being used as donors, something that in the West we could never conceive happening, yet in China this is happening on a broad scale systematically. Our next speaker from the United States, we're now joined by Dr. Kathleen Thimsen, Associate Professor of Forensic Nursing. Dr. Kathleen Thimsen received a master's degree from Johns Hopkins University and a doctorate of nursing practice from Regis University, an awarded expert speaker and author on forensic nursing, education, and wound care. Outside of China, in the West, the recipients are much part of the problem as much as the perpetrators of these crimes. Transplant tourism and transplant tourists travel to China from across the world. Forced organ harvesting is indeed an international affair, not just an internal one. Let's now hear from Professor Thimsen's perspective.
Good morning. Our topical area to be addressed includes forensic nurses as we unite against forced organ harvesting. Who are forensic nurses? We're registered nurses with advanced education and training in forensic science, legal aspects of care, and nursing that relate to caring for victims who have had their lives impacted in any way by violence, crime, and/or trauma. Forensic nurses have access to being generalist or specialized in many of the subspecialties within the forensic nursing profession. In terms of forced organ harvesting, this specialty that we call upon our work to occur in is that within the human trafficking domain, and we have been advancing human trafficking and forensic nurses for about 20 years globally. So what is forced organ harvesting? That's the killing of individuals by the state for forcibly extracting human organs or bodily tissue for transplant. The victims. Sometimes we don't always see who these victims are because oftentimes our victims are the vulnerable populations that are oftentimes considered to be disposable people. Those persons living with health disparities and in circumstances associated with social determinants of health, specifically impoverished populations, those folks with limited education, those persons who have no voice and are victimized at the hands of illegal and economic exploitation that benefits no one. Preying on these victims impacts not only the individual, but their family, their friends, their communities, and ultimately the nations. The act and conduct of forced organ harvesting is a significant public health issue as well as a human rights violation to the many persons that are implicated during the transplant procurement, retrieval, and implantation process. Victims of forced organ harvesting are indeed victims that meet the definition and would benefit from victim-centered trauma-informed care and responses that are foundationed in empowerment, resilient, theoretical frameworks that improve clinical as well as psychosocial outcomes. The victims of this forced organ harvesting are twofold, and they're joined by that one organ that's used for transplant. The primary violation of human rights is of the victim who was being forced to donate their organs for transplant under extraordinary measures, whether they're incarcerated, they're homeless, they're impoverished, or merely representing a class of people that, again, are vulnerable. Outcomes associated with this particular aspect of victimology are death, familial shame, and social impacts. The individuals who receive forced organ harvesting have no knowledge, potentially, at the time of their transplant planning or even the execution of the transplant procedure. Thus, they have no knowledge of the source or the quality of the organ that was or is transplanted. As a result, there are oftentimes medical complications that occur, organ rejection, guilt, shame, and remorse. So what are some of the responses that we should be looking at in terms of solutions? If the victim would survive forced organ harvesting, which doesn't occur very often, they will require intense trauma-informed care to reconcile the tragedy and aftercare procedures and protocols that are associated with health coverage and rehabilitative services, as well as including families whose lives have been affected because of a loved one being used as the donation point for whatever organ is being harvested, need to be included in a recovery fashion. And then the recipient of those organs that have been harvested through force. These are unknowing individuals whose acts of desperation because of the need for transplant resulted in harm, injury, violation, and potentially the death of the quest of that organ. Oftentimes have difficulties in psychological adjustment post-transplantation, but then compound that by the facts that surface on the process which are involved with the forced organ harvesting. These patients will undergo and need intense trauma-informed care, therapy to reconcile the realities of how their life came to be spared through the transplantation of organs obtained through such exploitive means. As forensic nurses, we are driven by action-focused programs, education, and research. My colleague, Deborah Holbrook, will provide you reference to some of these proven solutions. Thank you.
And thank you, Dr. Thimsen. Indeed, such an important element that you raise in your presentation of the need for rehabilitation of the victims and or their families, in fact. And that is something that not much is spoken about. But of course, in China, we can imagine that no such processes are available for those families who lost their loved ones to this horrific practice. Moving to our next speaker. Next, we're pleased to welcome Dr. Weldon Gilcrease, Director of Oncology and Professor at the University of Utah School of Medicine, USA. One of the key inspirations for this World Summit was the need to break the systematic silence on the egregious practice of forced organ harvesting committed in China. Our next speaker will address what this silence means for both the medical community and humanity as a whole. What are the implications for a medical doctor who took the medical oath? Can he remain silent when the core principle of the medical profession, which is to do no harm, is violated in the most conflicting way?
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining today. It's really an honor and a privilege to be talking to all of you about one of the most important medical ethical issues of our time, and that is forced organ harvesting. I wanted to shed light on several different points that I think are important in forced organ harvesting, and not so much an overview of the evidence and data, but the experience of what do we do with the evidence and data, and how does this get disseminated into our medical institutions. So the first issue I wanted to bring up was the silence that has surrounded forced organ harvesting, despite David Matas and David Kilgore's first report back in 2006, and subsequently in the last 15 years, Ethan Gutman's report, the 2016 update to the Bloody Harvest and the Slaughter, by David Matas, David Kilgore, and Ethan Gutman, as well as the findings of the independent tribunal in 2019 and 2020,
after looking at all the data, all come to the same regrettable conclusion, and that is that forced organ harvesting is indeed happening in Chinese medical institutions and transplant centers throughout the country, and this has gone really unrecognized by most of the medical community and indeed most of the world. So how has this silence been able to happen? I'd like to give a personal example. I'm at a moderate-sized academic institution in the mid part of the United States, and at our own institution, I and others have tried to do what we can to take action to stop forced organ harvesting. And one example of that is myself and somebody who runs the transplant line at our institution, where we do a moderate number of transplants annually, have tried in our own way to stop bringing Chinese over here to train in transplant and to go back to China, where they will likely participate in forced organ harvesting. And so what has happened? Well, this has not been formalized by our institution, and when I have reached out to leaders and at our institution, I essentially always get the same response, and that is there's no doubt that forced organ harvesting is happening, but that taking a stance against a large, strong country such as China could be dangerous both to our institution as well as the undergraduate and graduate schools that we serve with at our university. And one example of this was in late 2019 when I approached one of our leaders in the medical system and said that we must take a stance and we should all sit down and have a discussion about what we're going to do about forced organ harvesting, especially in light of the fact that the China Tribunal had just published their report in which they had interviewed well over 50 individuals and looked at all the data and reports themselves, mostly data that came out of China showing that they had no explanation for their incredible and exponential boom in transplant activity beginning in the early 2000s, aside from the explanation that they were killing innocent individuals for their organs. This kind of egregious and mass crime has never really been at the hand so largely of the medical community in history. So when I approached our leader of our medical institution, he essentially said to me that there was no doubt in his mind that the Chinese Communist Party was capable of such atrocities and that it was indeed happening, but that if we said anything, China would simply send all of its students to Texas. Well, this struck me as odd. We're not in Texas, and why would it matter if they sent their students to Texas? This kind of fear of, I think, economic retaliation has been directing, I think, a lot of the approach that we've taken. And I'm further concerned that at our own institution, in my own clinic, we've had and trained at least 2 Chinese individuals in pulmonary medicine and cardiothoracic surgery who really would find no way out of being independent when they return to China, as essentially all individuals, including all doctors and surgeons in China, are always under the thumb of the Chinese Communist Party. Further, we have individuals here who collaborate and work closely with Chinese institutions, including going over there and giving lectures and having individuals from China here, in fact, working in our laboratories and in our clinics, and such as one such individual who has Chinese working on his R01 grant in his lab. So why have we taken this approach of collaboration and engagement with China? There's a great editorial by Wendy Rogers, Matthew Robertson, and Jacob Levy that was published in the BMJ back in 2017 that I encourage you all to read. It's simply a page detailing the approach that the Transplantation Society has taken, and indeed the medical community at large, and that is one of engagement and cooperation with China after the 2006 David Matus and David Kilgore report came out. So has this stance of engagement and cooperation and collaboration worked? Well, the short answer is no. We've taken similar approaches from a diplomatic and an economic stance in the United States, really to detrimental ends. One example of this is you've seen in the last couple of years top scientists and top physicians and academicians at our institutions that have had to leave their post because of their close ties and their financial ties with the Chinese Communist Party, which they were not reporting to our federal government, which they're required to do. So if, for example, at MD Anderson in 2019 and at Moffitt Cancer Center in Southern Florida in late 2019, early 2000, 9 leaders, none of which were Chinese or Chinese American, were forced to resign or left their posts because of not reporting their close ties to the Chinese, with the Chinese government to the United States. So you can see the dangers of this close engagement and collaboration, but it's worse than that. I think collaborating and cooperating with a medical system that's under the thumb of an evil regime is dangerous. And indeed, we've seen this with forced organ harvesting. This didn't happen in a vacuum, and in fact, most of the individuals that have built the transplant centers in China, as was bragged about on medical sites before the 2006 report came out, trained in the United States and other leading Western organizations in transplant medicine. And transplant medicine remains one of the greatest medical advances of our time. And so this isn't an issue with condemning transplant, but it is an issue of condemning an evil system that's using transplant for evil means. One of the other things that I think is important to point out is that the Chinese Communist Party is neither China, the country, and the history and the culture, nor is it the Chinese people. This is the wool that the Chinese Communist Party has managed to pull over the eyes of its own individuals as well as the eyes of the rest of the world. And that is they would like to have the world believe that the Chinese Communist Party is synonymous with China, the country, and the Chinese people, and thus any attack on the Chinese Communist Party is an attack on its people and the country. Well, nothing could be further from the truth, and in fact, nothing could be more opposite. In trying to condemn the Chinese Communist Party for its horrible human rights abuse in forced organ harvesting, you try to keep the country and the people clean and free from the evils that the Chinese Communist Party has used the Chinese medical system to carry out. And when making these kinds of statements, it's often perceived as quote unquote getting political, and this is a term that the Chinese Communist Party likes to frequently use. Political or not, our medical field must stay free from politics. This doesn't mean avoiding making uncomfortable positions against the Chinese Communist Party, and in fact it means we should say something against the Chinese Communist Party if it is going to and continue to co-opt our field, our experts, our physicians, and our surgeons. So it is something that we must say, and something that we cannot remain silent on. The last thing I want to point out is the idea that even if China today cleaned up its transplant abuses, which it can't, we must hold those accountable and responsible for these egregious crimes to task. This is something that I think is important to prevent it from ever happening again, and is something that I think is the only way to justifiably handle what we've allowed to happen over the last 15 years within our medical field. Lastly, I'd like to thank all of you for being here. I think that as one common voice, we can make a difference. We can make a difference in our institutions, at our transplant centers, but it simply will take a strong, unified voice saying that we simply can't tolerate this to continue happening, and we can't say nothing because as we've said nothing, we've seen that it does continue to happen. Thank you all for your time, and I'm happy to answer questions a little later. Thank you.
And thank you, Dr. Gilcrease. Indeed, you raised some really important questions, and I think a lot more we might endeavour to cover in the Q&A session that will happen at the end of our formal presentations today. From the US, again, we have the honour of listening to Professor Emeritus Ray Skeleto. He's a former professor at the GWU Medical Center and former chair of the Board of Trustees of the American Medical Association. There is no doubt that national and international medical organizations play an important role in addressing any form of medical malpractice. Have they met their responsibilities? Has there been indirect complicity on behalf of these international governing bodies? Let's hear Professor Skeleto's insights on these important questions.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be speaking in this very important conference. I'm going to discuss organ transplantation and the responsibilities of medical organizations. Nationally, and here in the United States, medical societies such as the American Medical Association, the AMA, issue ethical guidelines on transplantation. Failure to comply could result in practitioners' censure and loss of license by the Federation of the State Medical Boards. And for the facilities that engage in unethical practices could lose certification, and there could be litigation and loss of reimbursement. And loss of reimbursement, you're out of business. So what are the codes of ethics on transplantation of organs from living donors? The AMA has gone into considerable detail. I'll just mention a few of the key points. As far as donors and recipients, we need an advocacy team for protection and to diminish risk. We need mutual agreements in advance from the donor and recipient. There should be no conflicts of interest, such as payments for and commercialization of transplants. And in the future, we need agreement that future United States transplant trainees agree to these ethical principles before they can be allowed to enter into the transplant programs. What are the international issues? The AMA is a constituent and leading member of the World Medical Association, the WMA. This is a global federation of national medical associations, which include the People's Republic of China, the PRC, which is also a member. They meet several times a year and guided by the Executive Committee. The WMA represents millions of international physicians to achieve the highest possible standards of medical care and ethics, and the AMA has significant influence. The WMA in 2020 issued a declaration to prevent and battle transplant-related crimes. Previous resolutions condemned the many reports of continued violations of these ethical standards by the PRC with imprisoned members of Uyghurs and the Falun Gong. What about the World Health Organization? Well, that is in the WHO, the World Health Organization, is an agency of the United Nations responsible for international health. The WHO and the WMA, the World Health Organization, and the World Medical Association have no regulatory authority. The WHO's Declaration of Istanbul in 2018 has similar ethical principles. However, it is silent on the problems of organ tourism and organ harvesting in China. The custodial transplant surgeons of the Declaration issued a declaration in June of 2020 which cautioned against scientific misconduct, and they stated that physicians should affirm allegiance to the guidelines regarding organ trafficking and tourism, and that journals should affirm their adherence to that goal. The China Tribunal. This is an independent organization in London. It concluded in 2019 that China has committed, quote, crimes against humanity, unquote, with forced and deadly organ harvesting over at least 20 years. A recent article in the Annals of Surgery titled Lung Transplantation for Elderly Patients with End-Stage COVID-19 Pneumonia from China raised serious ethical concerns as to how the lungs for the recipients were obtained within 3 to 4 days. In the United States, with a huge registry of transplant donors, much larger than China, the minimal wait time for this type of donation, the minimal, is 15 days. And the question is, why was such sick and elderly patients chosen? And why is there no information about survival after 5 days in the journal, the Annals of Surgery? We participated in the critique of this article that was published. The authors of the transplant article, their response to the critique has been non-existent or evasive. And one can seriously question the rationale why the Annals of Surgery would publish such a controversial article that did not address the ethical principles. In conclusion, in spite of national and international ethical guidelines, organ trafficking, organ tourism, and transplantation abuses continue. Sadly, in China, there is no transparency or commitment to these guidelines. Thank you for allowing me to participate in this important program.
Indeed, Professor Skeleto, these crimes are horrific, and new guidelines and international regulations are much needed to address this. With us today, we have Professor David Bader, Chair of the Department of Bioethics and Medical Humanism of the University of Arizona. The topic of his speech will be the invisible victims of forced organ harvesting, an ethicist's perspective. Professor Bader has been outspoken about the transplant abuses in China for many years and hosted several seminars about this topic. A top expert in his field and a dedicated advocate for ethics, Professor Bader values humanity and each individual as a person. Please welcome Professor Bader.
Well, thank you so much for the privilege of having a conversation with you all. Unfortunately, this is not something that would really garner a lot of, I guess, excitement because it is a very difficult issue to talk about. So I'm going to come across from the perspective of the ethics and the morals. So let me begin by asking you a question. Have you ever felt invisible? Have you ever felt like you were no one, standing in front of someone else or being spoken to, as if you didn't exist? Let me give you an example. How many of us have gotten our car to a red light and stopped, and out of the corner of our eye on the left side, we notice a homeless man or homeless person? And we don't look at them. We just can't wait to get going with the green light because we don't want to acknowledge that homeless man, thinking we need to give him something. But by virtue of the fact that we don't even look at him, we denigrate his personhood. He doesn't exist. And from my perspective, this is where I'm coming from with this whole aspect of forced organ harvesting from persons who don't exist in the minds of those who operate on them, who use them as a commodity, who use them to benefit themselves, rather than understanding that receiving an organ is a gift. So I come back to this whole concept of personhood. When we talk about personhood, that entitles everyone who's recognized as a person to rights. And the more common rights are dignity, honesty, trust, integrity. The minute that we denigrate someone by not recognizing them as a person, we can take advantage of them. We can use them. We can actually belittle them by making them just an it or a something, a commodity. In this world of forced organ harvesting, we see that this is in fact the case. The persons who are taken and put into prison and who are then used as a commodity for organs are not considered persons. They're considered, as I mentioned, a commodity. And the surgeons who operate on them, and I use that word loosely, operate, they butcher them, they're not persons themselves because they find themselves being more into who they want to be and finding out that they are more what they are. Truly, truly not persons. We as physicians have oaths, responsibilities, we have obligations. And the primary obligation, responsibility, and duty we have is to recognize the person who's sitting across from us seeking our help as someone who we believe in as a person. A person is a person. We engage with them. We have a relationship with them. We have trust with them. There's a sense of dignity. But what we're seeing in this situation with this forced organ harvesting is that there is none of that. And from the ethical perspective, there is this significant moral just devastation of moral foundations on the part of those who take advantage of these vulnerable people. The individuals, and you notice I'm not even calling them persons, the individuals who seek out an organ by paying for it large sums of money, they themselves are not necessarily persons because they are self-gratifying themselves at the expense of someone else. So the long and short of it is, from the medical, ethical, moral perspective, there is no moral intake or input on the part of those who seek the organs other than this self-gratification, this whole concept of me first, me principle. The surgeons who do these atrocious things to the vulnerable, they themselves are so far outside the boundaries of the profession and the vocation of healing, are they themselves completely unworthy of the gift that was given to them of being a physician healer. So from my perspective as an ethicist and as a critical care physician, I come to you by sharing that this whole concept of personhood that concept of personhood, which we all entail as the most important part of who we are, is completely destroyed, is denigrated, is void from all aspects related to the atrocities that are occurring with forced organ harvesting. So I pose the question again, have you ever felt invisible? And I submit that yes, those who have been captured and who have been forced into a submission of their organs being taken are invisible. I don't think you and I would ever want to be like that. We don't ever want to be invisible. We want to be seen as persons. Appreciate your time, and thank you.
Indeed, such powerful words there from Professor Bader, and really touching on what it means for us to be humans and how we treat each other as human beings. Finally, I have the privilege to announce our last speaker for today. We are honoured to welcome Dr. Declan Lyons, Professor of Psychiatry at the Trinity College in Dublin, Ireland. He will explore the vital elements of ethics in medicine as the pillar for clinical care. What new ethical grounds should China's doctors aspire to in order to shift away from the systematic transplant abuse? Let's listen to our next speaker delve deeper into these crucial questions.
Thank you for the invitation to take part in this World Summit on Combating and Preventing Forced Organ Harvesting in China. My name is Declan Lyons. While I'm taking part in this summit, I'm deeply concerned about continuous reports of human organ harvesting in China, which I believe represent gross violations of ethical medical practice. I'm a medical doctor living and practicing in Ireland, and I'm deeply worried about the activity of some Chinese colleagues who quite simply prioritise power over ethics. To be silent regarding these dramatic departures from very basic ethical norms, to me, is unconscionable. As ethical decisions are an everyday component of daily medical practice, disparity in clinical ethical practice anywhere weakens bioethics everywhere. The allegations are that organ transplantation is big business, estimated to be $1 billion business per annum in China, and up to 60 to 100,000 transplants occur on an annual basis in the People's Republic. Obviously, the source of most organs we know for decades has been executed prisoners, but there was a welcome move to voluntary organ donation and a system in 2015 of that. But the UN Special Rapporteurs in June of this year believe ethnic, linguistic and religious minorities in China are still targeted for involuntary organ harvesting. We know that hearts, kidneys, livers and corneas are the most frequently removed organs. Many clinical personnel are involved in this process, including surgeons, anaesthetists, physicians and nursing and other medical professionals. And there is very little data emerging from China to investigate or refute these concerns. In terms of our ethical obligations, doctors everywhere need a good grounding in clinical ethics. We need a perceptiveness which helps us understand the overt and more covert ethical principles underlying our everyday practice. We need to be ever vigilant about the ethical implications of everyday practice and be ready to review and change our practices, procedures and protocols. We need to demonstrate competence, care and communication to create a therapeutic environment within which trust is developed between clinician and patient, and that should be implicit. There is therefore a mutual education process where clinician and patient learn about each other, and then the process of healing moves on apace. When doctors advocate for patients and behave professionally and responsibly, for example in the maintenance of confidentiality in terms of patient records, basic trust is established and maintained. Trust is vital if patients are to seek and obtain the necessary help from doctors. It can't be taken for granted. Basically, we need to behave our way continually into greater and greater trust. Quite simply, I believe the patient is a guest in our house and should have considerable authority and very justifiable expectations of care, the care that they receive. This is increasingly acknowledged in terms of how doctors are trained and educated, and medical professionalism is a new discipline. It's becoming a new subject on the medical education curriculum, spanning undergraduate training and postgraduate training and continuing professional development. Arguably, medical professionalism and ethical awareness is the only subject that doctors will continually learn for the rest of their career. The principles of ethical practice are, first of all, do unto others, respect patient autonomy, do no harm, aim to be good and be just in the execution of your work. Ethics in many ways is a subtle awareness of closing the gap between who we are as doctors. As humans, we may be frail and fallible, but who we're capable of being. Crystallized professional skills, therefore, are as important to medical practice as knowledge itself, which is increasingly democratized and available on the internet. But ethical violations which are overt and outrageous, such as we hear about in China, such as forced organ harvesting and trafficking, this offends medics everywhere. Individually, clinicians must ethically confront issues such as the basic conflict of interest between being an agent of state repression or a patient advocate. The two are simply incompatible. In reality, forced and voluntary organ harvesting has taken place for decades in China. This has been widely admitted, with the assistance, I'm sad to say, of medical personnel. There has been no counter-evidence or credible response of denial of these allegations from the appropriate authorities. The medical community globally, I believe, is largely ignorant or incredulous of these practices, as the violations are so profound and grave. People basically assume that they cannot be true. Doctors have a duty, where possible, to act in society's interests. There is no doubt about that. For example, protecting public health. And in our role, doctors, nurses, and indeed information and facts save lives. And society listens to this counsel and protects lives, even by entering economic recession voluntarily, as we've seen all across the world in the case of a pandemic lockdown. The fallout from what we're seeing in China and what is alleged in terms of death, mutilation and psychological trauma of prisoners of conscience in detention in China is severe and profound. Basically, a vulnerable population remains incarcerated and could experience torture and death at any time. And I believe trust in medicine across an entire continent, across the globe, will be damaged and could lead to resistance and complacency in the face of future global pandemics, for example. What credibility will doctors have in the future if they are prepared to tolerate such gross deviations from ethical practice? State-sponsored cruelty, moreover, will erode moral and civic values that should underpin sustainable human development. Lack of autonomy or ownership of one's own body simply destroys a central feature of human existence, something that we take very much for granted. How do we respond to these allegations? We must investigate. We must investigate again and yet investigate still further. The authorities in China must respond. If progress has been made since 2014 in reducing forcible organ extraction, then publish the data and allow its verification by the international community. We need internationally validated registers of all organ transplantations that are occurring in China to restore any sense of credible belief about their origin. We need to educate doctors in China about their ethical obligations, particularly those attending overseas training programs in organ transplantation. We must engage with the international community. China must engage with the international community or risk isolation. Biological threats such as viruses, as we've seen, recognize no human borders. I think an example would be the early sharing of COVID-19 genome, which allowed global response and vaccine development. And this cooperation and collaboration between medicine was extremely helpful in allowing us retain hope over someday controlling and eliminating this pandemic. But conversely, disparity in bioethics anywhere weakens bioethics everywhere in all corners of the globe. Altruism, not state coercion, needs to be engendered in organ donation in China through public education. Altruism and generosity is the very essence of organ donation, I believe. There must be a clear distinction of criminal behaviour perpetrated by doctors and everyday ethical lapses, which are still commonplace and are tolerated everywhere. But the level of ethical lapses and derogations from basic ethical conduct that we're seeing in China are extreme, and sanctions will be differentiated and dictated by this clear distinction. Diplomatic and commercial stakeholders also cannot be ignored. They are increasingly vocal in terms of human rights concerns in China. This is the public discourse everywhere in 2021. But adhering to good medical ethical standards filters out many difficult emotions in terms of everyday ethical practice, such as fear, such as stigma and shame within the medical profession, which can be very common. And it allows a sense of personal fulfillment. So it's in the interests of doctors in China to educate themselves about basic ethical norms. We need to build better habits. We need to standardize our practices, improve our systems. We need to have the greatest level of health for the largest number of people, to let people lead lives to the fullest potential, as opposed to mutilating innocence at the behest of the state or for personal profit. Medical professionals can lead impactful careers by overhauling their ethical and professional standards and achieving excellence. I don't believe anyone sets out to be cruel or to abandon a sense of vocation at the earliest opportunity in a career in medicine. But above all, we need to cultivate a generation of well-rounded clinicians in China who are exemplary, who are role models, and who match their country's undoubted technological prowess. My own personal motives. I'm not a Falun Gong practitioner, but I have lent my voice and support when I realised Falun Gong practitioners were being mistreated by forensic psychiatry colleagues in the Humankind network since 2001, and I have been speaking out against these practices since then. I would support anyone's right to freedom of religious practice, even though I'm not a Falun Gong practitioner. The practice of Falun Gong may not appeal to everyone, but their moral code of truthfulness, compassion and tolerance has universal relevance, I believe. A 22-year persecution is simply too long. China's global leadership and development aspirations will be stunted by an increasing focus on human rights, and this is the test that China must pass if it is to be fully accepted by the international community. Protecting human rights and safeguarding the environment will mark out successful societies during the 21st century. When will the Chinese Communist Party live up to these responsibilities, I ask? If we were to rewrite the Hippocratic Oath in 2021, we would write it something like this. In 2021, it is my vocation to treat not just the illness we encounter, but to think of each patient as a whole person and to behave respectfully, treat skillfully and compassionately as we expect to be treated when we ourselves inevitably become ill, and that will happen. I pledge to be a role model in my health and general disposition for my family and community and those mentors who have selflessly guided me along my educational path, on which I remain for the benefit of my patients. That is an upgrade to the Hippocratic Oath, and I urge Chinese doctors to reflect upon it. Thank you.
And thank you, Dr. Lyons. What an appropriate way to conclude our session today with that new updated Hippocratic Oath. And thank you very much to all our distinguished speakers. What an incredible array of perspectives we heard today. Thank you to our audience who joined us today I believe we have been advised that there are thousands watching our summit today over multiple platforms across YouTube and directly registered audience members. So absolutely amazing. And sorry I don't see your faces, but I just wanted to acknowledge all of you today. We will now be transitioning to our Q&A session, where our registered attendees will be able to post questions.